Rain hammered against the cracked windows of an abandoned meat packing plant on the edge of a city that had forgotten this place existed long ago. Inside, beneath flickering industrial lights that cast dancing shadows across blood-stained concrete, 3 men stood in a triangle of death. Each held a weapon. Each had a reason to kill. And only one would walk out of this building alive. The first was Lazarus Vorn, a man whose hands had ended more lives than he could remember, yet trembled now for the first time in 15 years. His gun was pointed at the second man, Aurelio Santoro, the most powerful crime boss the Eastern Seaboard had ever known, a man who had pulled Lazarus from the gutter and made him into a weapon of precision and terror. And the third. Detective Silas Brennan stood with his service pistol aimed directly at Lazarus's temple, his finger a whisper away from ending everything. But what nobody in that room could have anticipated, what would shatter the very foundation of everything they believed about themselves and each other, was the photograph that lay on the floor between them. A photograph of 3 young boys, arms around each other, smiling in front of a burning building. "You remember now, don't you?" Aurelio's voice cut through the silence like a surgeon's blade. "You both remember. How did 3 men, bound by a childhood they had buried so deep it became a different life entirely, end up here? With loaded guns and souls heavy with betrayal, secrets, and a truth so devastating that pulling the trigger might actually be a mercy? This is not just a story about crime. This is not just a story about justice. This is a story about the lies we tell ourselves to survive, the monsters we become to protect what we love, and the impossible choices that define whether we are saved or damned. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment right now telling me where you're watching from. I want to know what corner of this world brought you here tonight. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now. You're going to want to be here for every twist and turn because I promise you, what comes next will leave you breathless. Now, let me take you back. 23 years before that warehouse. Before the guns. Before the blood. Before the lies became more real than the truth. In a forgotten neighborhood where poverty was the only inheritance and violence was the only currency, 3 boys grew up in the shadow of the same crumbling tenement building. Lazarus, Aurelio, and Silas were inseparable, bound by the kind of brotherhood that only forms when you have nothing but each other. Lazarus was the quiet one. The boy with the haunted eyes who never spoke about the cigarette burns on his arms or why his mother never came home before midnight. He was small for his age, often targeted by older boys who smelled weakness like sharks detect blood in water. But Lazarus had something else. A stillness. A patience. The ability to wait, to watch, to strike at exactly the right moment when everyone else had forgotten he was even there. Aurelio was different. Even at 12 years old, there was a gravity to him that drew people in. He spoke like someone who had read 1,000 books, yet his knuckles were perpetually split from fighting. His father ran numbers for the local crew, and everyone knew little Aurelio was destined to take that seat and build it into a throne. He had vision. Ambition. And most dangerously, he had the intelligence to make his dreams reality. Then there was Silas. The idealist. The dreamer. The boy who actually believed the stories about heroes and justice and the idea that right could triumph over wrong if you just fought hard enough. His mother was a nurse who worked double shifts and still found time to read him stories about knights and noble causes. She planted seeds in his mind that would grow into something she never could have predicted. The night that changed everything came during the hottest summer any of them could remember. Lazarus's mother had finally pushed too far. Her boyfriend, a mountain of a man named Gerald, had beaten Lazarus so severely that the boy couldn't stand. When Aurelio and Silas found him behind the dumpster, his face was a mask of purple and crimson, and one of his arms bent at an angle that made Silas vomit into the weeds. "I'm going to kill him," Aurelio said. Not a threat. A promise. He was 13 years old, and he meant every word. "We should tell someone," Silas pleaded. "The police, a teacher, someone." Nobody cares about boys like us. Aurelio's words carried a weight far beyond his years. We take care of our own. What happened next would fracture their friendship and set each of them on a path that would lead, eventually, inevitably, to that rainy warehouse decades later. Aurelio convinced them to burn down the building. Gerald was passed out drunk inside Lazarus's apartment, and if they timed it right, if they were smart and careful, the problem would simply disappear. The authorities would call it an accident. A gas leak, maybe. Faulty wiring in an old building. Nobody would look twice at another tragedy in a neighborhood full of tragedies. Lazarus agreed. He was tired of hurting. Tired of being afraid to walk into his own home. Tired of his mother choosing her boyfriend over her son again and again until love became a word that meant nothing but pain. Silas refused. I can't, he said, tears streaming down his face. This is murder. I know he's a monster, but this makes us monsters too. Then don't watch, Aurelio replied coldly. But don't get in our way. That night, the tenement building burned. Gerald died in the flames. Lazarus's mother, passed out drunk beside him, perished too. 8 other residents, including 2 children who lived 3 floors up and could never get out in time, burned along with them. Silas watched from across the street, frozen in horror, as the building became an inferno. He watched his 2 best friends standing in the orange glow, their faces illuminated by the flames, their souls being forged into something new and terrible. A photographer from the local paper captured them before they fled. 3 boys, arms around each other, caught in a moment that looked almost like celebration. The photo ran the next day with a caption about neighborhood youth witnessing tragedy. No one ever suspected those 3 boys had caused it. After that night, everything changed. Lazarus was sent into the foster system, where he bounced from home to home, learning that survival meant becoming invisible until the moment you needed to strike. He learned to fight. He learned to kill. By the time he was 18, he had enlisted in the military, and by the time he was 25, he was a ghost, a special operations soldier whose file was so classified that even his commanding officers didn't know his real name. Aurelio's father recognized something in his son after the fire. A coldness. A capability. He accelerated the boy's education, bringing him into the family business at an age when most children are worrying about school dances and summer jobs. By 20, Aurelio had eliminated 3 rivals. By 30, he controlled half the city. By 40, his name was spoken in whispers, and those whispers carried fear. And Silas? The guilt ate him alive. He couldn't forget the screams he imagined coming from that building. He couldn't forget the 2 children who died because of a fire he could have prevented. So he became the thing he thought might balance the scales. He became a cop. Not just any cop, the kind who never took a bribe, never looked away, never compromised. He became the detective that criminals feared because he was incorruptible. He was also the detective who had been hunting Aurelio Santoro for 15 years without ever getting close enough to touch him. They had scattered to the winds, these 3 boys. They had built new lives, new identities, new purposes. None of them knew they were still running from the same night. None of them knew the flames that brought them together would eventually drag them back. And none of them suspected that their reunion was being orchestrated by someone who knew exactly what had happened that summer night, someone who had been waiting decades to watch all 3 of them burn. The package arrived on Lazarus's doorstep without warning or return address. He lived in a modest apartment in a city 3,000 miles from where he'd grown up, working as a security consultant for wealthy clients who needed protection from threats they couldn't explain to the police. It was a life of shadows and silence, and it suited him. But the moment he opened that manila envelope and saw the photograph inside, the carefully constructed walls he'd built around his past crumbled like ash. 3 boys. A burning building. A secret he had buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it belonged to someone else. There was a note attached. Typed. Anonymous. I know what you did. I know what all three of you did. The Santoro compound. 3 weeks. Or the world knows too. Lazarus's hands did not shake. He had trained himself out of that weakness years ago. But something cold moved through his chest, something that felt almost like fear. He hadn't seen that photograph in over 2 decades. He had assumed every copy had been destroyed, every trace of that night erased by time and careful planning. Someone had been watching. Someone had been waiting. Across the country, in a penthouse that overlooked a glittering skyline, Aurelio Santoro received an identical package. He was 63 years old now, silver-haired and distinguished, with the kind of presence that commanded respect and the kind of eyes that inspired terror. His empire had grown beyond anything his father could have imagined, legitimate businesses layered over criminal enterprises so skillfully that even the most determined investigators found themselves chasing phantoms. When Aurelio saw the photograph, he did not call for his guards. He did not summon his lawyers. He sat in perfect silence for 17 minutes, staring at his younger self, remembering the heat of the flames and the sound of breaking glass and the absolute certainty he had felt that night that he was doing the right thing. His phone rang. A private line that only 3 people in the world knew existed. "You received it too," Lazarus said. "Not a question." Aurelio's voice was steady. "It appears our past has developed a voice." The third package would have gone to Silas. "Yes. I've been monitoring his career from a distance. He's been hunting me for years, you know. Never got close. Too protected, too insulated. But if he receives this photo, he becomes unpredictable." Aurelio was quiet for a moment. "We need to meet. All 3 of us. If someone is attempting to weaponize our shared history, we need to understand who and why before we can craft an appropriate response." Lazarus almost laughed. "Almost. You want me to sit in a room with a police detective who has dedicated his life to destroying everything you've built? And you expect that to go well? I expect us to remember what we once were to each other. Before the fire. Before the choices that turned us into who we became." What neither of them knew was that Silas had already opened his package. He sat in his cramped office, surrounded by case files and cold coffee and the accumulated weight of a career spent chasing justice in a world that didn't want to be just. The photograph lay on his desk like an accusation. For years, he had told himself that he was the innocent one. That he had refused to participate, that he had tried to stop them, that the blood was on their hands and not his. But looking at that photo, at his younger self standing arm in arm with Aurelio and Lazarus, his face illuminated by flames that had killed 10 people, he couldn't maintain the lie anymore. He had watched. He had known. And he had said nothing for 23 years. The note that accompanied his photo was different from the others. "Detective Brennan. You have built your entire identity on the idea that you are a good man. But you and I both know the truth. You are just as guilty as they are. The only difference is that they accepted what they were. You have spent your whole life pretending to be something else. 3 weeks. The Santoro compound. Or I release everything, the photo, the fire department records I've recovered, the testimony of a witness you thought died in the flames. Your choice. A witness. Someone had survived." Silas's hands began to shake, and this time, he could not stop them. The 3 weeks that followed were a masterpiece of tension and paranoia. Lazarus used every skill he had acquired in decades of black operations to investigate the source of the photographs. He called in favors from people who existed in the cracks between governments and criminal organizations, people who could find anyone, anywhere, given enough time and motivation. But every trail led to dead ends. Whoever was orchestrating this had resources that matched or exceeded anything Lazarus had access to. That terrified him more than the threat itself. Aurelio, meanwhile, went about his business with an outward calm that masked furious activity beneath the surface. He tripled security at all his properties. He had his most trusted lieutenant, a mountain of a man named Vittorio Graves, begin quiet inquiries into anyone who might have had access to records from that long-ago fire. And Silas? Silas began drinking. Heavily. For the first time in his career, he called in sick. He sat in his apartment, staring at the photograph, reliving that night again and again, hearing the screams that had haunted his dreams for over 2 decades. The survivor. That was the key. If someone had escaped the fire, if they had been watching and waiting all these years, then this wasn't just blackmail. This was revenge. On the night before the 3-week deadline, Lazarus arrived at the Santoro compound. It was a sprawling estate north of the city, hidden behind walls and trees and an army of security personnel who examined every inch of his vehicle before allowing him through the gates. Aurelio met him at the door personally. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. 23 years had changed them both. Lazarus had grown lean and hard, with gray at his temples and scars that told stories he would never share. Aurelio had aged into his authority, becoming the kind of man who entered rooms and immediately became the center of gravity. "You look terrible," Aurelio said finally. "You look old." A ghost of a smile crossed Aurelio's face. "I've missed you, brother." Lazarus didn't respond. He wasn't sure he could. The word brother carried too much weight, too much history, too much pain. "Silas arrives in an hour," Aurelio continued. "I had to incentivize his cooperation." "What did you do?" "I offered him something he has wanted for 15 years. A meeting. A chance to look me in the eye and understand why I became what I became. He believes he's walking into an opportunity to finally bring me down. He doesn't know you'll be here. This is a dangerous game." Aurelio's eyes hardened. "Someone is trying to destroy everything I've built. Everything you've built. And in doing so, they're threatening to expose a night that will ruin Silas's career and send all 3 of us to prison for the rest of our lives. This isn't a game. This is survival." Detective Silas Brennan pulled up to the Santoro compound with his service weapon loaded and his heart pounding against his ribs. He had spent 15 years building cases against this organization, and in all that time, he had never once been invited inside the walls. This was either the greatest opportunity of his career or a trap that would end his life. Possibly both. The gates opened smoothly, and he drove through landscaped grounds that seemed designed to intimidate. Every tree had been perfectly placed. Every curve in the road had been engineered to give security personnel maximum visibility. By the time he reached the main house, Silas felt like he had already been dissected and analyzed by a dozen invisible eyes. Vittorio Graves met him at the door. The man was enormous, with hands that looked capable of crushing skulls and eyes that suggested he had done exactly that on multiple occasions. "Detective. Please follow me. I want it on record that I'm here voluntarily. That this is a conversation, not a negotiation." Vittorio's expression didn't change. "Follow me." Silas was led through a house that mixed old-world elegance with modern security. Cameras everywhere. Reinforced doors. The kind of architecture that said, "You are allowed to be here because we permit it, and that permission can be revoked at any moment." The room they entered was a study lined with books and dominated by a massive wooden desk. Aurelio stood behind it, dressed impeccably, every inch the legitimate businessman he pretended to be. And sitting in a leather chair by the window was a ghost. "Lazarus," Silas breathed. He hadn't spoken that name in over 20 years. Hadn't allowed himself to remember the boy who had been his closest friend, the boy he had abandoned the night of the fire, the boy who had disappeared into the system and, according to everything Silas could find, simply ceased to exist. "Hello, Silas." Lazarus's voice was deeper now, roughened by time and experience. "You look like you've seen a ghost. You were dead. The records, everything said." "I know what the records said. I wrote most of them myself." Lazarus stood, and for a moment, all three of them existed in the same space, breathing the same air, connected by a thread of shared history that had stretched thin but never quite broken. Let me ask you something while we're here at this pivotal moment. What would you do if your entire past suddenly came back to haunt you? If the people you once loved, the secrets you thought were buried, the choices you made when you were too young to understand the consequences, what if all of it crashed back into your life at once? Take a moment and really think about that. Drop your answer in the comments below. I genuinely want to know what you think. Would you run? Fight? Confess? Let me know. Now, back to our story. You've both received the photographs, Aurelio said, breaking the silence. You've both received the threats. The question before us is simple: who is responsible, and how do we neutralize them? Silas laughed bitterly. You're asking me to work with you. To collaborate with the most notorious criminal organization in this region. To become exactly the kind of corrupt cop I've spent my entire career trying to destroy. I'm asking you to survive. Aurelio's voice was patient, almost gentle. Because make no mistake, detective. If those photographs become public, if the investigation that follows uncovers the truth of what happened that night, you will lose everything. Your career. Your pension. Your freedom. Possibly your life, because I promise you, there are people in prison right now who would love an opportunity to revenge themselves on the detective who put them there. And what about what you deserve? What about justice for the 10 people who died because of what we did? Justice. Aurelio spoke the word like it was a foreign language. An interesting concept from a man who has spent 23 years knowing the truth and saying nothing. You could have confessed at any time, Silas. You could have turned yourself in, testified against me, accepted your share of the responsibility. But you didn't. Because despite all your talk of honor and integrity, you wanted to live your comfortable life more than you wanted to face the consequences of our shared sin. Silas had no response. The truth of Aurelio's words hit him like a physical blow. Lazarus spoke then, his voice cutting through the tension. This isn't productive. We can argue about guilt and justice until the sun burns out, but it won't change our situation. Someone has evidence that could destroy all three of us. That someone wants us here, together, for a reason. We need to focus on that. The note mentioned a survivor, Silas said quietly. Someone who lived through the fire. Aurelio's expression flickered. Just for a moment, but Lazarus caught it. You know something. I know many things. But this particular piece of information. I had hoped I was wrong. Aurelio moved to his desk and pressed a button. A panel in the wall slid open, revealing a safe. From inside, he produced a folder that looked decades old, yellowed with age and handling. After the fire, I had my father's people investigate. Thoroughly. I needed to know if there were any loose ends, any witnesses, any evidence that could connect us to what happened. The official investigation concluded that all residents either escaped before the fire reached their floors or perished inside. But my investigation found something different. He opened the folder and spread its contents across the desk. Photographs. Medical records. Newspaper clippings. Her name was Celestina Moreno. 8 years old the night of the fire. She lived in the apartment directly above yours, Lazarus. When the flames started, her mother carried her to the window and dropped her 3 stories into a garbage collection container below. The mother didn't make it out. But the girl survived. Silas stared at the photograph of a child in a hospital bed, bandaged and broken, eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. She would be 31 now, Lazarus said slowly. If she survived her injuries, yes. But I lost track of her after she was placed in foster care. The records were sealed, and by then, I was focused on building the organization. I assumed she was too young to have understood what happened, too traumatized to remember specific details. You assumed wrong. Silas picked up one of the documents. These are therapy notes. Who got these? They arrived with my photograph. Our mysterious antagonist wanted me to understand exactly who I'm dealing with. Aurelio's voice was flat. Celestina spent years in therapy working through survivors' guilt and trauma. But according to these records, she never forgot the 3 boys she saw from her window that night. The 3 boys who were standing in the alley below her building, watching it burn, with what she describes as, he read directly from the document, expressions of satisfaction and triumph. That's not what happened, Lazarus said. I wasn't triumphant. I was in shock. What you felt doesn't matter. What she perceived does. And according to her therapist, Celestina has spent her entire adult life searching for those 3 boys. Searching for justice. The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a shroud. A little girl had watched them from a window. A little girl had fallen 3 stories and broken half the bones in her body while her mother burned to death above her. A little girl had grown into a woman with a purpose, and that purpose was their destruction. We have to find her, Silas said. Talk to her. Explain. Explain what? Lazarus's voice was sharp. That we're sorry? That we were children who made a terrible decision that cost her everything? That we've spent 23 years running from what we did while she lived with the consequences every single day. So what do you suggest? We just let her destroy us? I don't know what I suggest. But I know that whatever happens next, we owe her the truth. Not excuses. Not justifications. The truth. Aurelio was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Softer. More like the boy he had been before the fire transformed him into something cold and calculating. I've done terrible things in my life. Things that would horrify both of you. I've ordered deaths, ruined families, built an empire on suffering and fear. I told myself it was necessary. I told myself I was protecting my people, my territory, my vision of how the world should work. But it all started that night. Every choice I made after the fire was built on the foundation of what we did. We became monsters, all 3 of us. Just different kinds of monsters. Silas looked at the man he had hunted for 15 years and saw, for the first time, the boy underneath. The boy who had decided to burn down a building to protect his friend and had been living with that decision ever since. What happens now? Silas asked. Now, Aurelio replied, we wait. The deadline is tomorrow. Our mysterious Celestina has arranged for us to be here, together, for a reason. I suspect we'll find out what that reason is very soon. She came at midnight. The security systems that had protected the Santoro compound for decades simply stopped working. Cameras went dark. Motion sensors failed. The army of guards that patrolled the grounds found themselves locked in their barracks, their communications equipment dead, their weapons mysteriously jammed. Celestina Moreno had spent over 20 years preparing for this moment. She had learned patience from watching her mother burn. She had learned strategy from decades of studying her targets. And she had learned something that none of them had anticipated, she had learned to become a ghost. The door to Aurelio's study opened without a sound, and she was simply there. A woman in her early 30s, with dark hair and darker eyes and scars that traced patterns across her arms and neck. She was dressed in black, and she moved with the fluid grace of someone who had made violence into an art form. In her hands, she held a detonator. Gentlemen, she said, and her voice was like ice over broken glass. I've imagined this moment for so long that I wasn't sure it would ever actually arrive. And yet, here we are. The 3 boys who killed my mother. Finally in the same room as the woman she made me become. Lazarus was on his feet instantly, but Celestina raised the detonator. The compound is rigged with enough explosives to level everything within a quarter mile. This detonator is linked to my heartbeat. If I die, we all die. If I choose to press this button, we all die. The only way any of us walks out of here is if I allow it. What do you want? Aurelio asked. His voice was calm, but Lazarus could see the tension in his shoulders, the calculation in his eyes. I want you to know me. I want you to understand exactly what you created that night. And then I want you to choose. Choose what? Celestina smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing any of them had ever seen. I've spent 23 years learning everything about all three of you. Lazarus Vorn, the hitman. Aurelio Santoro, the crime boss. Silas Brennan, the detective. You each chose a different path after the fire, but those paths all lead back to the same origin point. You are who you are because of what you did to me and my mother. She began to pace, the detonator never leaving her grip. Lazarus. After the fire, you bounced through 7 foster homes in 4 years. The abuse you suffered made the beatings from your mother's boyfriend look like gentle corrections. You learned to be invisible, to be patient, to strike without warning. You became an assassin because the world taught you that survival meant killing before you could be killed. She turned to Aurelio. You took the lessons of that fire and applied them to everything. You learned that power protects. That fear prevents betrayal. That if you're strong enough, ruthless enough, no one can ever hurt you or the people you care about again. You built an empire of blood and terror because a 12-year-old boy decided that if he was going to be a monster, he would be the biggest monster in the room. Finally, she faced Silas. And you. The righteous one. The hero. You've spent your entire career hunting criminals like Aurelio because you can't stand to look at what you really are. Every arrest, every conviction, every victory you've claimed has been an attempt to wash away the blood on your hands. But here's what you never understood, detective. You can't wash away blood. It only spreads. I'm sorry, Silas said, and his voice broke on the words. I know that doesn't mean anything. I know it can't undo what we did. But I am sorry. I've been sorry every single day since that night. Your sorrow is worthless to me. Celestina's eyes were flat, emotionless. Sorrow doesn't bring back my mother. Sorrow doesn't give me back the childhood I lost in hospital beds and foster homes. Sorrow doesn't erase the nightmares that have haunted me for 23 years. Then what do you want? Lazarus asked quietly. Celestina was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Still cold, but with something fragile underneath. I want to understand. I've studied you all for so long, but I still don't understand. How do you live with yourselves? How do you wake up every morning, knowing what you did, and just continue? How does that work? It was Aurelio who answered. We don't. Not really. We survive. We distract ourselves with purpose, with work, with the endless pursuit of something that might, for a moment, make us forget. But we don't live. Not in the way I imagine people who haven't done what we've done get to live. We just exist, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Waiting for someone like you to finally come and demand the payment we always knew was owed. Celestina stared at him, and for a moment, her mask slipped. Underneath the cold vengeance, Lazarus saw a little girl who had watched her mother burn. A little girl who had fallen 3 stories and shattered her body on impact. A little girl who had grown up alone and afraid and consumed by a pain that never faded. The night of the fire, she said slowly, my mother woke me up when she smelled the smoke. She was calm. I remember that. Even when the flames were coming through the door, she was calm. She told me everything would be okay. She told me she loved me more than anything in the world. And then she threw me out the window. Tears were running down her face now, but her hand on the detonator never wavered. I watched her burn. From the ground, with my legs twisted at angles that didn't make sense, I watched the fire consume her. I heard her screaming. I heard her calling my name. And then I saw you 3. Standing in the alley. Watching it all with expressions I've never been able to forget. We didn't mean for anyone else to get hurt, Lazarus said. That doesn't excuse anything. It doesn't make it better. But Gerald was hurting me. He was going to kill me eventually. And nobody cared. Nobody was going to help. We were just children trying to solve a problem we didn't know how to solve any other way. Children. Celestina laughed, and it was a sound like breaking things. You were children. I was a child. My mother wasn't. She was an adult who went to work every day and came home every night and made me dinner and helped me with my homework and told me stories before bed. She was a good person. A kind person. And she burned because you were too young and too stupid and too scared to find another way. The weight of her words hung in the air like smoke. And then, something remarkable happened. The door behind Celestina opened, and Vittorio Graves stepped through. His massive form blocked the exit entirely, and in his hands, he held something that made everyone in the room freeze. It was a little girl. Perhaps 7 years old, with dark hair and terrified eyes. I apologize for the interruption, boss, Vittorio said, his voice emotionless. But one of our men found this child during a sweep of the perimeter. She appears to be related to our guest. Celestina's composure shattered completely. Isabella. Isabella, baby, no. You were supposed to stay with the Harrington family. You were supposed to be safe. Mommy. The little girl squirmed in Vittorio's grip. Mommy, I was scared. You were gone so long, and I got scared. The revelation hit the room like an explosion. Celestina had a daughter. Celestina, the woman who had come here to destroy them, who had rigged an entire compound with explosives, who had spent 23 years planning the most elaborate revenge any of them had ever witnessed, was a mother. Aurelio raised his hand, and Vittorio immediately set the child down. Isabella ran to her mother, and Celestina caught her with her free arm, the detonator still clutched in the other. The transformation was instantaneous. The cold Avenger disappeared, replaced by a mother holding her frightened daughter, a woman suddenly and terribly vulnerable. It's okay, baby, Celestina whispered. Mommy's here. Mommy's got you. Who are these men, Mommy? Why are they looking at you like that? Silas stepped forward slowly, hands raised to show he meant no harm. We're old friends of your mother's, he said gently. We knew her a very long time ago. Before you were born. Isabella looked at him with suspicious eyes. Mommy never mentioned any old friends. No, Celestina said, her voice rough with emotion. I suppose I didn't. Lazarus spoke next, and his voice held a tenderness that surprised even him. What's your name? Isabella Moreno. I'm 7 years old, and I'm in 2nd grade. She recited the facts like a child who had been taught to introduce herself properly. Isabella. That's a beautiful name. Lazarus knelt down so he was at eye level with the girl. I'm Lazarus. I know this is confusing and scary, but I promise you, no one here is going to hurt you or your mom. Okay? Isabella studied his face for a long moment. Then she nodded. Okay. Celestina's hand was shaking now. The detonator trembled in her grip, and for the first time, she looked uncertain. Lost. Like she hadn't planned for this possibility, hadn't imagined a scenario where her daughter would be standing in the same room as the men she had come to destroy. Celestina, Aurelio said carefully. I'm going to ask Vittorio to take Isabella somewhere safe. Somewhere she can have something to eat and watch some television while the adults finish talking. Is that acceptable? Celestina's jaw tightened, but she looked down at her daughter's face and something in her expression softened. Isabella, this man is going to take you to get some ice cream. Mommy will come find you very soon. Okay? Promise? I promise. Vittorio extended his hand, and Isabella, after a moment's hesitation, took it. They walked out of the study together, the massive enforcer moving with a gentleness that seemed almost comical given his size and reputation. The door closed. And the 5 became 3 again. She doesn't know, Celestina said quietly. About any of this. About what I've been planning. She thinks we're on vacation. She thinks I'm a normal mother with a normal job and a normal life. She's beautiful, Silas said. She has your eyes. Celestina's laugh was bitter. She has her father's eyes. He left when she was 2. Couldn't handle the nightmares, the therapy, the weight of everything I carried. He said I was obsessed. He said I was letting my past destroy my present. She paused. He wasn't wrong. Lazarus stood slowly. What happens now? I don't know. Celestina stared at the detonator in her hand like she had forgotten it was there. I had a plan. Such a beautiful, perfect plan. I was going to make you understand what you took from me. I was going to watch you suffer. And then I was going to press this button and take us all down together. Justice, finally, after 23 years. And Isabella? Celestina flinched. She was never supposed to be here. She was supposed to be safe. She was supposed to have a life that wasn't destroyed by the fire that destroyed mine. Aurelio moved slowly, carefully, around his desk. He approached Celestina with the caution one might use with a wounded animal. When I was 12 years old, he said softly, I watched my best friend get beaten so badly he couldn't stand. The adults who should have protected him had failed completely. The systems that were supposed to keep children safe had abandoned him. And I made a decision that seemed right at the time. A decision that cost innocent lives. That cost your mother's life. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough that she could see the genuine pain in his eyes. I have done many terrible things since that night. Things that make the fire look like a minor offense. But I have never stopped carrying the weight of what happened. I have never forgiven myself. And looking at you now, standing in this room with a detonator in your hand and a daughter waiting for you in the next room, I understand something I didn't before. What? That revenge doesn't fill the hole. That vengeance doesn't bring back the dead. That no matter how much suffering you cause us, your mother will still be gone, and you will still be the little girl who fell 3 stories and broke her body on impact. Killing us won't make you whole. It will just leave your daughter orphaned, the same way you were orphaned 23 years ago. Celestina was crying openly now. The detonator shook in her hand, and Lazarus tensed, ready to move if she pressed it accidentally. I don't know how to let this go, she whispered. I don't know how to be anything other than the girl who watched her mother burn. This mission, this plan, it's been my reason for living since I was old enough to understand what happened. Without it, I'm just nothing. That's not true. Silas stepped forward, his detective's instincts giving way to something more human. You're a mother. You have a daughter who loves you. A daughter who needs you. That's not nothing. That's everything. She deserves better than me. Better than a mother consumed by rage. Better than growing up in the shadow of trauma she can never understand. Then give her better. Lazarus's voice was firm. Break the cycle. Choose differently than we chose. We were children who made a terrible decision because we couldn't see another way. You're not a child anymore. You can see another way, even if it's harder. Even if it hurts. The room was silent except for Celestina's ragged breathing. And then, slowly, she lowered the detonator. I don't forgive you, she said. I don't think I'll ever be able to forgive you. But I'm not going to let my daughter become what I became. I'm not going to let the fire claim another generation. She pressed a button on the detonator, and a small screen lit up, displaying a countdown that froze at 0. It was always disabled, she admitted. The explosives are real, but the detonator was never connected. I wanted you to feel what I felt that night. Helpless. Trapped. Watching destruction approach with no way to stop it. Lazarus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. There's something else, Celestina continued. Something I came here to do that didn't involve killing anyone. She reached into her jacket and produced a folder, thick with documents and photographs. I've spent years investigating not just the three of you, but the night of the fire itself. Who really started it? What really happened? And I found something that changes everything. She spread the documents across Aurelio's desk, and all three men gathered to look. Gerald didn't die accidentally. The fire didn't reach him before he could escape. He was murdered. Someone hit him over the head and left him unconscious to burn. And your mother, Lazarus. She looked at him with something that might have been sympathy. She didn't die in the fire either. The autopsy report was falsified, but I found the original. She was dead before the flames ever reached her. Strangled. Lazarus felt the world tilt beneath his feet. What are you saying? I'm saying you didn't kill them. You set a fire, yes. But someone else was in that building. Someone else made sure Gerald and your mother didn't escape. Someone who wanted them dead and used your fire as cover. The revelation hung in the air like thunder after lightning. Who? Aurelio demanded. Who would have had motive and opportunity? Celestina turned to the final page in her folder. It was a photograph, old and faded, of a man none of them immediately recognized. He was younger in the photo, perhaps mid-20s, with a face that was handsome in a cruel way. His name was Raphael Crane. 23 years ago, he was a low-level enforcer for your father's organization, Aurelio. He had aspirations. Ambitions. And he had been secretly in a relationship with Lazarus's mother for almost 2 years. Lazarus stared at the photograph, searching for any memory of this man. Nothing surfaced. According to my investigation, Raphael believed your mother was going to leave Gerald for him. Start a new life together. But she changed her mind. Told him it was over. That she was going to stay with Gerald, that whatever they had was finished. So he killed them both, Silas said slowly. Used the fire as cover. He waited for the perfect opportunity, and you provided it. He followed you that night, watched you start the fire, and then entered the building through a back entrance. He killed Gerald first, then your mother. And then he walked out and disappeared into the night, knowing that if anyone ever investigated, 3 children would take the blame. Lazarus felt something shifting inside him. For 23 years, he had carried the weight of his mother's death. He had blamed himself for the fire, for the choices that led to that night, for everything that happened after. And now? Where is he now? Lazarus's voice was flat. Dangerous. He changed his name. Built a new identity. Moved to another city and started over. But I tracked him down. Celestina handed Lazarus a final document. An address. A photograph of an older man, still handsome in that same cruel way, living in a comfortable house in a suburb far from the crimes of his youth. He never faced any consequences. He never paid for what he did. While you 3 have spent your entire lives running from the guilt of that night, he's been living freely. Comfortably. As if he never killed anyone at all. Lazarus looked at the address. Then he looked at Aurelio. Then at Silas. I'm going to kill him, he said simply. No. Silas stepped forward. We do this right. We do this legally. I can open an investigation, bring in the evidence. The evidence is 23 years old, Aurelio interrupted. Half of it would be inadmissible. Witnesses are dead or disappeared. Any prosecutor would laugh you out of the building. So what? We just let him walk? No. Lazarus folded the address and put it in his pocket. We don't. The 3 of them stood there, bound by history and guilt and a shared hunger for something that might not be justice but felt close enough. He's protected, Celestina said. He built a new life, but he never forgot where he came from. He has security. Contacts in local law enforcement. If you're going to do this, you need to do it right. Lazarus looked at her. Why are you helping us? An hour ago, you wanted us dead. Celestina's smile was sad and tired and somehow beautiful. Because killing you won't bring back my mother. But maybe this will bring some kind of closure. For all of us. They planned through the night. 3 men who had once been inseparable boys, working together for the first time in over 2 decades. Aurelio provided resources and intelligence. Lazarus contributed tactical expertise. And Silas, despite his reservations, offered legal knowledge that would help them avoid the most obvious traps. As dawn broke over the Santoro compound, Celestina emerged from the room where Isabella had been sleeping. The little girl was curled up on a couch, looking peaceful in a way that made all the adults' hearts ache. I'm taking her home, Celestina said. What happens next, that's between you and Raphael Crane. But I meant what I said. I'm done with revenge. I'm going to try to build something instead of destroying. Lazarus walked her to her car. The morning air was cool, fresh, carrying the smell of rain that had passed in the night. Thank you, he said. For the truth. For giving us a chance to face what really happened. Celestina looked at him for a long moment. You know, I always imagined you as monsters. All 3 of you. I built you up in my mind as these creatures of pure evil, responsible for everything wrong in my life. But you're just men. Broken in your own ways. Carrying your own guilt. Just like me. Does that make it better or worse? I don't know yet. Ask me in 20 years. She drove away with her daughter, and Lazarus watched until the car disappeared around a curve in the road. When he returned inside, Aurelio and Silas were ready. It took them a week to find the right approach. Raphael Crane had built a comfortable life, but he had never stopped being the man who could kill 2 people and walk away without a second thought. His current business ventures weren't entirely legitimate. His security wasn't as strong as he believed. And his arrogance had grown with age, making him sloppy in ways that a younger version of himself would have avoided. They came for him on a Tuesday night, while he sat in his study, drinking expensive bourbon and congratulating himself on how well his life had turned out. Lazarus entered first. Silent. Deadly. The skills he had honed over decades of black operations serving him well as he disabled 2 guards without raising an alarm. Aurelio came next, his presence commanding even in the darkness. The crime boss had left his organization in Vittorio's capable hands, personally involving himself in something that felt almost like justice. And finally, Silas. The detective who had spent 15 years hunting criminals like this. The man who had finally accepted that sometimes, the law wasn't enough. That sometimes, right and wrong existed outside the boundaries of courts and procedures. They found Raphael in his study, bourbon in hand, looking surprised and then terrified as 3 men emerged from the shadows. Who are you? What do you want? Lazarus stepped forward and placed the photograph on Raphael's desk. The one from 23 years ago. 3 boys, a burning building, a night that had changed everything. Recognition dawned in Raphael's eyes. And with it, fear. You remember now, don't you? Lazarus asked, echoing Aurelio's words from the warehouse that felt like a lifetime ago. It wasn't. I didn't. Raphael's composure crumbled instantly. It was so long ago. I was different then. Please, I'll give you anything, You killed my mother. Lazarus's voice was utterly calm. You killed Gerald. You let 3 children carry the guilt of what you did for 23 years. And you thought you got away with it. Silas placed documents on the desk beside the photograph. Evidence. Testimonies. Forensic reports that had been buried but not destroyed. You have 2 choices, Silas said. You come with me now, quietly, and we do this through the system. I've already made arrangements with federal prosecutors. The evidence is old but compelling. You'll spend the rest of your life in prison, but you'll live. Raphael looked at the three of them, calculating, searching for a way out. Or you try something, Lazarus said softly. And I do what I've wanted to do since the moment I found out the truth. The room was silent for a long moment. Raphael chose prison. They walked him out of his comfortable home in handcuffs, and Silas made sure every step of the arrest was documented, legal, unimpeachable. Federal agents were waiting. Prosecutors were eager. The wheels of justice, so slow to turn, finally began to move. 1 month later, Lazarus stood in a cemetery he hadn't visited in over 2 decades. The headstone was simple, weathered by time but still legible. His mother's name. The date of her death. Nothing else. Aurelio stood beside him. So did Silas. I thought I killed her, Lazarus said quietly. All these years, I thought the fire I started ended her life. I carried that weight every day, through every mission, every kill, every choice I made. And it was all based on a lie. Does it change anything? Aurelio asked. Lazarus considered the question. It changes everything. And it changes nothing. I still made the choice to burn that building. Innocent people still died because of what we did. Celestina still lost her mother. The fact that I didn't kill my own mother doesn't erase the rest of it. No, Silas agreed. It doesn't. But maybe now we can stop running. Maybe now we can actually try to live, instead of just surviving. They stood in silence for a while, 3 men who had been boys together, who had made a terrible choice together, who had spent 23 years becoming strangers to each other and to themselves. What happens now? Lazarus asked. Aurelio smiled, and for a moment, he looked like the 12-year-old who had once promised to protect his friends at any cost. Now we rebuild. Different paths, but not strangers. Not anymore. Silas nodded. I'm going to have to find a new obsession now that I'm not hunting you anymore. I'm sure I can provide references, Aurelio replied dryly. There are plenty of criminals who deserve your attention more than I do. Lazarus laughed. It was a strange sensation, like using a muscle that had atrophied from neglect. Brothers, he said, and the word didn't hurt the way it used to. They walked out of the cemetery together, 3 men who had finally stopped running from a night that had shaped their entire lives. Celestina sent a photograph 6 months later. Isabella, smiling, holding a handmade card that said thank you in a child's uneven writing. On the back was a message. We're going to be okay. All of us. Finally. Lazarus kept that photograph on his desk for the rest of his life. Now, I have something to ask you. You've stayed with me through this entire journey. Through the fire and the guilt and the revenge and the truth. You've watched 3 boys become broken men and find their way back to something like hope. And that means something to me. If this story touched you, if it made you feel something real, I need you to share it. Pass it on to someone who needs to hear that redemption is possible, that the weight of our past doesn't have to define our future, that even the most broken things can be mended. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I don't know what you're waiting for. This channel is where stories like this live. Stories that stay with you. Stories that matter. Every time you don't subscribe, you're choosing to miss the next one. Don't make that choice. Hit subscribe. Turn on notifications. And share this story with someone who needs it. I'll see you in the next one.